It's true that in the last few years, we've been through a huge conflict between the United States and Russia over Ukraine, a burning war between Israel and Palestine, and a life-threatening pandemic, COVID-19. But still, we are making videos, and you are watching them, perhaps holding a coffee mug or a slice of pizza in your hand, which means the world has not fallen apart yet. It's still at peace and trying its best to maintain it. People still have dreams, and everything is doing pretty much all right. To whom do we owe all these? Only to the dear Lord, our parents, or Mother Nature? Not really, but also to this man, a Russian naval officer from the 60s, Vasili Aleksandrovich Arkhipov. Yes, a lot of you haven't even heard of his name before this video, but the irony is that he is the reason the world survived. New generations came, or you and I exist. September 2nd, 1945. A very underrated great day in world history. It was the day when World War II was finally over. But the problem with the wars is that they never really end. So, after Hitler's fall, World War II just converted into a Cold War between the two supreme powers of the world, the US and Russia. A nasty spy game started, and each nation started building lethal nuclear weapons that were capable of wiping off countries from the world map forever with just 2 or 3 missiles. Had there been any World War III at that time, it's guaranteed that a lot of countries would have been destroyed and the rest of the world would have become like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or much worse, like an apocalypse. There had been multiple close calls, though, when it seemed like a nuclear war was just one step away. But the worst-case scenario kicked in 1962 when the Cuban Missile Crisis took place. In late 1961, Comrade Fidel Castro asked the Soviet Union for more anti-aircraft missiles because he was worried about the United States attacking Cuba. He wanted to make sure Cuba had enough defense to prevent airstrikes and to show the US that Cuba was prepared to protect itself. On the other hand, the Soviet Union wanted to support Cuba because that would keep the US under pressure with Soviet surveillance. But initially, the Soviet Union ignored Castro's request. Naturally, Castro got pissed off and turned to China, another communist power, for financial help. But this worried the Soviets. In March 1962, Castro even removed people who supported Moscow, which made the Soviets more nervous. They thought they were losing their grip over the US. So, in response, the Soviet Union sent more missiles and troops as it was connected to the decision to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. However, to keep the American reign intact in the neighboring countries, the US increased attacks on Cuba, and in January 1962, they made plans to overthrow the Cuban government. During the Cold War, there was a big sensation in the West called the Missile Gap, which was a belief that the Soviet Union was making long-range missiles called ICBMs faster, in larger quantities, and with better capabilities than the United States. But in reality, President John F. Kennedy's claim of a missile gap was wrong, as the US had a big advantage in missiles. But Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev didn't know that. He thought Kennedy was weak. So, in May 1962, Khrushchev wanted to catch up with the United States by putting missiles in Cuba. He also wanted to make sure the US didn't have too much influence there. The deployment involved extensive confidentiality and deception, known as maskirova, which means masking or covering up. Originally, it was about camouflaging in the military, like using smoke to hide on the battlefield. The mission was conducted under the code name Operation Anadir. The idea was to send around 60,000 people to help the main group of missiles. The main missile force had 3 groups of R-12 missiles and 2 groups of R-14 missiles. The Cuban leadership was also expecting a US invasion, so they approved the idea. Khrushchev and Castro agreed to the secret placement of strategic nuclear missiles with tight secrecy. Despite all the cautiousness, by August 1962, the US discovered the plan, and this just made the relationship more tense between the United States and the Soviet Union. A war was just knocking on the door. President Kennedy gathered a group of advisors called XCOM to figure out what to do. They considered the option of directly attacking Cuba, just like Russia attacked Ukraine in 2022. But finally, the United States decided on a less aggressive approach, implementing a naval blockade to prevent more Soviet missiles from reaching Cuba. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy went on TV to broadcast that there were missiles in Cuba, and he started a naval blockade, and both the US and USSR got ready for a possible war. Different countries had different reactions here, like China supported Cuba, and European nations supported the US. But the most fearful fact was that all these countries had their nuclear weapons. So if any war happened, it would have been 10 times more fatal and destructive than both world wars combined. Naturally, both governments were worried, and on October 26, 1962, they tried to go into some negotiations for removing the nuclear weapons from the territory. But to further worsen the matter, news came that the U.S. reconnaissance plane U-2 was shot down in the Caribbean, and the U.S. believed the Cubans wouldn't dare to shoot it down. Instead, the Soviets would use a surface-to-air missile, signaling an escalation in the conflict. On October 27th, after some failed deals and brainstorming, the government finally started planning airstrikes. The U.S. told its NATO allies about the possible military action, and the CIA said Cuba was ready with missiles. Castro's Armageddon letter also hinted that if Cuba was attacked, they might use Soviet nuclear weapons as a response. It was one of the closest calls for World War III ever. Then, finally came the night of October 27th, which, according to the historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., was not only the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in human history. 4 Soviet submarines were heading towards Cuba, and all of them were Foxtrot-class submarines with regular torpedoes and one special torpedo carrying a 15-kiloton nuclear warhead. The Soviet officers were told that if they couldn't communicate with Moscow, only the captain and political officer needed to agree to launch a nuclear torpedo. Vasili Arkhipov was on one of these submarines, B-59, as the chief of staff. On October 27, 1962, a group of 11 U.S. Navy destroyers and the U.S. Randolph aircraft carrier spotted the B-59 near Cuba. Even though the submarine was in international waters, at roughly 5 p.m., the U.S. Navy started using depth charges explosives to signal and force the submarine to surface for identification. However, the officers on B-59 thought the Americans were trying to make their submarine sink. On top of that, considering the continuous depth charges from the Americans, Captain Valentin Savitsky assumed that World War III might have already started. In the meantime, the Soviet crew on the submarine couldn't talk to Moscow for days. They were too deep underwater to listen to regular U.S. radio. So, the submarine's batteries were almost dead. The Foxtrot submarines were made for cold Arctic waters, not for warm Caribbean seas. The temperature inside also reached above 100 degrees Fahrenheit due to a broken air conditioning unit, making a lot of carbon dioxide. So the crew members kept passing out. They needed to come up to the surface to get fresh air. But the captain, Savitsky, was worried that if they surfaced, any American ship might capture them and destroy them. Suddenly, there's another big explosion near the sub, making everyone fall and breaking out a fire. We thought, that's it, the end. Crew member Vadim Orlov later shared the experience with National Geographic. It felt like you were sitting in a metal barrel, which somebody is constantly blasting with a sledgehammer. Even though the explosion was close, the sub's hull didn't break. But at that moment, Savitsky finally decided to launch a nuclear missile, willing to sacrifice himself and his crew to destroy U.S. destroyers and an aircraft carrier nearby. So, he instructed that a torpedo armed with a 10-kiloton nuclear warhead should be fired at a U.S. aircraft carrier located nearby. Now, the twist was that the launch required approval from the submarine's 3 top commanders, Captain Savitsky, Second Officer Ivan Maslenikov, and the 36-year-old Second Captain and Brigade Chief of Staff, Vasili Arkhipov. Maslenikov said okay to launch, but it was Arkhipov who said no. He told the captain that the American small bombs were just signals, asking them to come up and show who they were. Savitsky and Arkhipov argued a lot, considering it insane and a suicide. But then, according to the report, something really dramatic happened. To launch a nuclear weapon, all 3 top officers had to turn a key at the same time in remote locks. Savitsky used his key, while Arkhipov put it in his mouth and swallowed it so no one could use it. Now, the only way to launch the missile would be to cut him open. As a result, the Soviet submarine had nothing to do but come up to the surface where a U.S. destroyer was waiting. But to their surprise, no violence happened. The Americans didn't even bother to go into the submarine or check it out. Just their negotiations revealed a Cuban blockade. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet submarine captain Savitsky tried to avoid U.S. anti-submarine forces. The sub's conditions were terrible, and experts say that if they had charged nuclear torpedoes out of the blue, the U.S. might have also responded with nuclear weapons, and for sure, a lethal nuclear war would have broken out instantly. Thankfully, after some tough talks, an agreement was reached, avoiding a nuclear war. Archipov's action of bravery and presence of mind were praised, and he got a promotion for preventing a disaster as well. But this was not the first time Arkhipov kept his cool and averted a disaster. Something almost similar happened in July 1961, too, when Arkhipov became the deputy commander and executive officer of the newly commissioned ballistic missile submarine K-19, which belonged to the Hotel class. Shortly after conducting exercises off the southeast coast of Greenland, that submarine encountered a serious leak in its reactor coolant system, causing a failure in the cooling system. To prevent a nuclear reactor disaster, Arkhipov told his team to find a solution because no backup plan was there. They had to do this because otherwise the nuclear reactor could have melted down, spreading radiation into the outside world. So, despite the risk of high radiation, Arkhipov and the crew chose this option over a nuclear meltdown. No wonder this man saved humanity again in 1962 from World War III, a near extinction. The irony is that when all the national leaders and suited, booted government officials in comfortable office rooms took forever to decide whether to go or not to go to the war, just one naval officer under extreme conditions in an underwater submarine pointed out what the right path would be for mankind. And that's this man for you, the one who saved the world.